Now, I remember you saying yesterday when Mr. Blair was sat here and I asked him the question about Saudi-US relations, he did kind of dodge it a little bit. Right? Now, I asked him, what is the impact on Saudi-US relations if the US becomes self-sufficient on oil? And he kind of did this.
Yeah, it was straight out of the Alastair Campbell playbook of how not to answer a question you don't want to answer.
He obviously learned very well.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Well, I'm going to try and answer the question for my former boss in his absence today. I think the Saudis have got three good reasons to worry about the reliability of the United States as an ally into the medium term, by which I mean next year, okay. Let's say. First of all, there's the energy boom in the US, about which Daniel Youre has talked at length this morning. There's no need for me to say any more about that, other than to underline that the US simply does not need Middle Eastern oil anymore.
Does not need?
Does not need Middle Eastern oil anymore. Secondly, Iran. I think if the Saudis believe that the West is going to cozy up with the Iranians quite rapidly now following the nuclear deal and last week's very important election result, the Saudis are quite right in the case of the Europeans at least. Now, it will take longer with the Americans, but the Saudis will also be mindful of the fact that in the period between 1953 and 1979, Iran was America's closest ally in the Middle East, bar none. And whilst I agree totally with what TB said yesterday about Iran not dropping its regional aspirations, that doesn't mean that its relationship with the US couldn't evolve quite significantly over the foreseeable future.
Okay.
But thirdly, and perhaps one of the things which will determine the speed with which the relationship evolves with the US and Iran, is who is going to win the next US presidential election. And I want to take the obvious two scenarios from where we stand today. First of all, the optimistic scenario, Hillary Clinton.
The optimistic scenario?
The optimistic scenario.
Okay.
Yeah, I know some of you won't be particularly optimistic about that, but let's think, we'll come to the other one in a moment. Hillary Clinton was one of the two parents of the so-called strategic pivot to Asia, the other being Bob Gates. They invented it in 2011. Barack Obama has largely ignored it. I am in no doubt that if Hillary Clinton is in the White House in a year's time, we will see the Pentagon working hard to achieve its stated objective of 60% of US naval resources in the Pacific Basin by 2020. Now, I also think that you will see the Pentagon working very hard to achieve an objective stated by Admiral Richardson, the new Naval Chief of Staff, at the end of October last year, when he said the US is going to redeploy more warships to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean to counter the growing Russian naval threat there. And in a world of constrained resources, a strategic pivot to somewhere inevitably means a strategic pivot away from somewhere else. And what Richardson let slip at that press conference when he was asked the question was that there were absolutely zero US carrier groups in the Gulf region on the 31st of October last year. Now, if you consider that for most of the past decade there has been at least one, usually two, and sometimes three US carrier groups out of a total of 10 in the Gulf region, this already tells us that something has changed. America's level of commitment of its naval resources to this region has changed. Now, I have grave reservations about the value of aircraft carriers in a world of cyber warfare. Nevertheless, they are the largest and most impressive manifestation of US military power today. So the pivots will probably take the US away from this region. Now, let's take what is still a realistic scenario, which is a President Trump. We don't know much about President Trump's policies. As Marco Rubio remarked recently in one of those fiery debates of ill-tempered mudslinging that they now pass off as being candidate debates in the US, Trump only has 5 policies. In fact, Rubio only managed to come up with 4. So I think maybe his mathematics is a bit shaky. But what we can reasonably assume from what we've heard from Trump to date can be summed up in one word: isolationism. protectionism, getting allies to pay for US forces based in their countries, leaving President Putin to get on with Syria, building a Russian sphere of influence. None of this sounds particularly good to me. And I have to say that if we do see a President Trump in the White House, we may well see an American drawdown of forces from all sorts of parts of the world. And that historically periodic feature of American policy, isolationism, coming back very much to the fore. And none of us is going to enjoy the consequences of that.
Well, that's a very scary prospect, right? I mean, based on what you're saying, but does he have a realistic chance of winning?
Yeah, if you look at the opinion polls today, if you take the RCP average, Real Clear Politics average, Trump in a head-to-head with Clinton is 2.8 points behind her. Statistical margin for error in US opinion polls, probably about 5%. Now, Trump is getting people to vote in America today whom the opinion pollsters do not reach. Look at the turnout on Super Tuesday. Democrats down, Republicans up. Trump will get people to go out and vote for him. Clinton has got to get the vote out. Now, I still think that Clinton is going to be the next president of the United States from where we are today, but I have to warn you, ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump has so far defied all the pundits, me included. Why do we think he's going to stop doing that for sure right now?
I really hope I hope you're not proven wrong on this one. Okay, but if we just take that Donald Trump thing one step further, I mean, clearly you've told us what that means for the US and its international relations, the allies, etc. But kind of what does it mean for this part of the world?
We know even less about what Trump thinks about the Middle East. He said that he would renegotiate with Iran. He said that he would be neutral on Israel-Palestine. But other than that, I think the word he has used has been he'd bomb it. Bomb what wasn't clear.
Well, that's really helpful, obviously.
Yeah. I don't know if he has a profound knowledge of the geography of the region. I don't know if he, who knows?
It's a bit like his program where it says, you're fired, right?
Yeah,
so we're just
absolutely.
going to say, you're bombed.
Absolutely.
Right, okay.
Okay.
Right.
So let the audience bomb us.
Let's the audience get involved in this. Right, so the rest of the session is over to you guys. Raise your hand if you have a question for Alastair. One over here, sir. Right.
Yes, good afternoon. We've heard a lot of pessimistic views today. Anything going well in this world? Any positive?
I think this is the wrong session for you to ask that. This is geopolitics, right? Alastair, any good news in geopolitics?
Well, the first piece of good news is that it's a really bad year to be a fund manager, but it's a really good year to be a political analyst. More seriously, I started the year by pointing to 5 markets which I thought, provided you have a strong stomach, you were likely to do pretty well in. And in alphabetical order, if I can remember them in alphabetical order, they are Argentina, and I think Macri has out-impressed even what I had expected from him at this stage. And I think Argentina is a very worthwhile place to look. India, I know we've heard some dismal things about India, but I do think it's going to continue to do relatively well. Iran, for the reasons I've mentioned, I think it's very promising. Myanmar, where things do seem to be going in the right direction, and steady as you go, Vietnam. I like all 5 of those markets. If you want a sector, I'm going to go back to something I said a moment ago and something Vikram said as well, cyber defense. Now, I agreed with most of what Vikram had to say today, but as I was saying to him in the margins just in the break there, the one thing I disagreed with is he's actually wrong about cyber warfare. It's not a future event, it's a current event. It's called hybrid warfare, and it is exactly what the Russians are playing today. And as Vladimir Putin himself remarked infamously a couple of years ago, in future war will not even be declared. Gentlemen, ladies, Vikram is right. This is big business. And if you look at the stocks which impressed most in the US last year and outperformed, a lot of them were cyber defense related stocks. So those are the areas that I would be picking on personally. Other than that,
well, that's great.
yippee, it's all doom and gloom.
Some good news, and you just told him about cyber warfare. So that's that. You got your good news.
Yeah,
sir.
it's all relative.
Right. Okay, next question, please. Over here in the front.
Every time they put up a number, I keep thinking it's a judgment on my last answer out of 10. That one was 4.
I have 2 questions. The first one, what's your opinion on Turkey?
Let's do them one at a time. Okay, so what's your opinion on Turkey?
I think Turkey is a very fine country with lots of very fine people. Unfortunately, one of them doesn't seem to be sitting in the president's office at the moment, if you want an honest answer. I am deeply concerned by what is happening in Turkey today over the constitution, over the relationship with the Kurds, over Turkey's relationship with Russia. I am fearful that there will be another military clash between Russia and Turkey, which could greatly unsettle markets. It is a high probability risk. It is not a tail risk. In any sane and sensible world, if we think about Turkey from a market perspective, for years, FX traders have been saying to me, the single most important piece of data coming out of Turkey is current account deficit. And, it's gone down enormously because of the drop in energy costs. And the lira ought to be doing really well. And what's it doing? Pretty badly. And I think that says it all from a market perspective. And what is keeping it down? It's the politics, it's the regional conflicts, and so on and so forth. Turkey is a country which is now underperforming where it should be. Now, to give AK credit, for the first 5 or 6 years that they were in office after the 2002 election, they did a lot of really great structural reform. They took the economy forward. They lifted a lot of people in Anatolia out of poverty, and everything was hunky-dory. And then they got driven off course, initially in part because of the European Union. I have to blame the European Union for this by suspending the accession process because of the European Union's own internal politics. It brought the reform process in Turkey to a halt. And if there is one good thing which could come out of this refugee crisis in the short term, maybe even next week, 7th of March, when there's another Turkey-EU summit, maybe the EU is finally going to beat the Cypriots into submission and get them to accept that putting Turkey back on a serious track to EU membership is actually the right thing to do. But I think that is a probability which is probably less than 5%. If that were to happen, I would start to take a much more positive view of Turkey than I do today.
Okay.
Your second question?
Yeah.
You've partially answered the second one, but Russia, with the valuation of the ruble, they're engaged in a war already in Syria, and like you said, 5% or more chance in another war, maybe with Turkey, but where they're spending and where are they going?
Well, I need to make a confession on this. Keep in mind that I was a Cold War warrior. Okay, I used to work for the British government during the Cold War. The first time I met the man who is now the president of Russia, he was a dodgy colonel in Dresden. It was East Berlin, it was October 1989. So please feel free to offset for my personal history with these guys. I think Russia's in a deep amount of trouble. Democratic institutions have been pretty much wiped out as far as functioning properly is concerned. Most civil rights have been removed from Russia's people. The economy is clearly doing very badly. And the opposition, you'll recall this week was the first anniversary of the murder of Nemtsov. The opposition is petrified. Petrified. Vladimir Putin will continue to look for foreign distractions from domestic socio-economic stresses, which are going to continue to mount unless we see the price of Brent crude going back up quite considerably. And just for the record, I'm one of the 30 to 40 people at the end of this year. I'm with the majority of you in this room. There are Duma elections coming up in September. The last time we had Duma elections in Russia was in December 2011. They were followed immediately by serious civil protests on the streets of Moscow in particular, which went on for 5 months. Now, a lot of people say that that was caused by Medvedev and Putin playing musical chairs, but the real reason was that real incomes had been flat for the previous 4 years. President Putin has just presided over his first full year in office as president where real incomes in Russia on average have actually gone down. And I would be deeply worried if I were him, and I can tell you that he is, about the prospect of serious civil unrest breaking out in Russia in the foreseeable future. They've already had some experience of it. All the truck drivers went on strike in December. The Moscow ring road was blocked for 2 days, and so on. They know they have to try to defuse this, which is why he's been trying very hard to get sanctions relief in Ukraine, which he's failed to do and is likely to continue to fail to do, at least for the rest of this year. Now he's busy pursuing the Ukrainians in the courts rather than on the battlefield, but it's still the same conflict. So I'm not optimistic about Russia. Sorry.
Okay, question down here. Omar Mahana.
Thank you very much. What are your views about the likelihood of Brexit, and what are the ramifications in terms of impact on other countries, and particularly on Brexit? And it's a question I would have liked to ask Yanis, but I don't think you could see me from the angle that they were...
Particularly
on Brexit.
On Brexit.
Yeah.
I think, first of all, let me deal with that. I think Brexit and Grexit are completely divorced situations, in principle at least. Now, I talk quite a lot with Peter Mandelson on this subject, and I actually have a quote from Peter which I like, and that is that the Eurosceptic but ultimately pragmatic British will just about vote to stay in Europe. The simple fact is that we are too boring. You know, we're dull. If we were romantic, if we were all Scots like I am, then we'd go and do the Braveheart thing and do something really stupid and vote against our own economic interests. But I think in the end, we will vote to stay in. And I think one of the reasons we will vote to stay in is that although we have this, and you've heard a couple of people talk about this, including TB, this last 2 days, although we do have this Western democracy-wide anti-establishment sentiment running around, the British actually respect David Cameron. And Cameron will carry more weight with the British voters than the opportunistic Boris Johnson will. Now, Boris will probably still get his way out of this referendum because all the signs are, and there was another opinion poll on this yesterday, he will get to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and therefore the next Prime Minister of the UK. But I think he's going to be the Prime Minister of a UK which is still in Europe, and he won't take it out at that stage. So I think we will just about manage to vote to stay in Europe. If we don't, Greece is not the first place you should be looking at. The first place you should be looking at is probably Denmark. There is a right-wing nationalist party in Denmark which is polling about 21 to 25% at the moment, and which is watching this process very, very closely indeed to see if it can come up with a grounds to get Denmark out of the European Union. And it's because the Europeans know about that the out camp who is saying, oh, you know, it'll all be all right, we'll come up with a settlement and it'll be hunky-dory and we'll still have full access to the single market and so on and so forth, are completely wrong. They are completely wrong. Europe will punish Britain mercilessly in the event of the British voting to leave. 27 other EU leaders will lock themselves in a room, they will come up with terms for the UK, they will slap them on the table and they will say, take it and leave. And there will not be ready access for fund managers in the UK. Look at what one of the French ministers said yesterday. Don't assume that your passports into Europe will work in the event of voting out. And fund managers who do not believe that to be the case are deluding themselves, in my view. So in a major effort to keep the rest of the EU together, if the UK votes to leave, it will be a very tough divorce settlement. And the irony of that is that the people who are claiming that it wouldn't be are exactly the same people who in London 2 years ago were saying, if the Scots vote to leave, Alex Salmond's off his head if he thinks we're going to be nice to him. We will punish the Scots. Now, why do those people think that Brussels will feel any different about the UK to the way in which they felt about Scotland 2 years ago? Crazy.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. Any other questions? One over there. My friend Omar Bin Chan.
Hi. How do you see the map in the Middle East evolving in the next 20 years?
Phew. Well, it won't look anything like it does today, I guess. I hate to use this word because it has very negative connotations, but I guess I'd have to say balkanization. I do think the Kurds, they have their de facto state in northern Iraq in any case. I do think that 20 years from now, they will have a significantly bigger de facto state. I don't think they'll have a de jure state. I think that could be a bit tricky within 20 years. I'd like to think that the Palestinians may have their own state in 20 years' time. I did say the other day, and I warn you, I do politics, I do not do political correctness. I remarked in a meeting the other day, I can't believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to continue being prime minister for Israel forever. But then I remembered that his dad lived to be 101. So maybe Benjamin Netanyahu will still be prime minister of Israel, in which case there will not be a Palestinian settlement, I don't imagine. I hope at least that there will be peace. But right now, I wouldn't take that as a given. A lot of learned academics in Europe have drawn comparisons between events in Syria today and the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was a war fought between two branches of the same major religion in Central Europe, with a lot of foreign powers interfering. I think the only difference, as far as I can see, is that we managed to wrap it up in 30 years in Europe. I'm not sure that I would be that optimistic about Syria, and I do not mean that as a joke. I mean that as a serious and sad observation. I hope that the cessation of hostilities, which is now in place, is at least going to take us a little forward. But I think it's going to be very messy, very difficult indeed, and that there is a very long way to go with the story here. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm conscious you ignored this. Oh, well, there we go, at the back over there. Sorry, I'll come to Jess. I'll come to you. We'll do a couple over here. Okay.
Just a quick question. So the United States has been the custodian of global security for the past 70 years. And that security has been underpinned by freedom of navigation. They're the custodians of global navigation security. So if America decides to go home, what would happen to global trade?
Well, global trade's not looking too good at the moment in any case. Have you seen the most recent global trade data? It's not very encouraging. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a bit of geopolitical theory at you at this stage. There is such a thing as a geopolitical cycle, and in the course of the last millennium, we have seen 6 periods of hegemony prior to America's unipolar moment, the American hegemon, which has been basically around, you're quite right, since 1945. Every one of those periods of hegemon has been extremely good for economic growth. Barriers to trade have been removed, and societies have got more prosperous. Unfortunately, they've all ended in the same way. Barriers to trade have risen, societies have got less prosperous. What we would today refer to as nationalism has been resurgent. Think about where we are today. All these things are actually happening. And worst of all, they have finished up in violent conflict between the declining power and a rising power, what is known in geopolitical theory as Thucydides' trap, after a Greek philosopher who wrote about the war between Athens and Sparta, which was similarly based. So I'm quite cautious about where we're going right now. And I guess I would have to say you can look at this in one of two ways. If, like the Chinese Communist Party, you believe that America is determined that China will never rise to its rightful place in the global firmament and is trying to contain China's rise, and if America continues to exert the strategic pivot in the general direction of China, you'd have to say that the risk of conflict is quite high, and perhaps particularly over maritime borders in the South China Sea, to go very much to your question. And putting in brackets slightly after this, you're right about America policing the seas, but did you know that America has actually never ratified the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea? It's, from a Chinese perspective, it's very much do as I say, not do as I do with the US. Now, if it turns out that it's going to be President Trump and America's going to be isolationist and naval forces are going to be withdrawn, then guess what? China's going to police the South China Seas. You heard yesterday about OBOR, One Belt, One Road. Confusingly, the One Road bit is actually the maritime bit. And China has a point when it says it's actually building these islands because it wants to police the seas, because roughly 14% equivalent of China's GDP travels through that region by boat every day. So they have a very, very big interest in keeping the seaways open. So I'm not totally pessimistic about this at all. I think that the Asian powers, China, India, and also Shinzo Abe's Japan, boosting its defense spending, now has a boat with a flat deck, which it doesn't call an aircraft carrier, but planes fly off it. So, you know, I think that they will do their best to keep the seaways open. Personally, I'd much rather the Americans continue to do it for us. But I think there are countries out there who are ready to step into the gap should America step back.
Okay, we have one more over here. Down here, please, on the third row. Mama, just raise your hand again so we can find you.
I'll just make one thing clear while we're waiting for the question to be asked. One of the things I always try to do in these mixed audience sessions is to leave everybody of every nationality feeling equally upset with me. So,
I think we managed that so
yeah,
far.
I think we're going well so
fine.
far.
Okay, go ahead, Mama.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you a question more about the area we live in. We've seen things going from the Middle East in general, starting from Tunisia, going to this part of the world, to Yemen, and so on. We know that these wars don't happen as a reaction of one event or something. It started with what we call the Arab Spring, and we see it now. I'm sure a lot of people don't call it a spring. From your experience, what do you think that is, where would this area, how this region would look like in maybe 3, 4, or 5 years? What's all of this, what's happening here? Thank you.
Well, I think one thing is that civil society throughout the Middle East and North Africa has become very wary of the consequences of civil protest and regime ousting through popular uprising. And that means that although we are continuing to see civil unrest in all sorts of the parts of the world, some of which is regime changing, think about Ukraine, for example. Think about somewhere where I know you're all really familiar, you probably got it high on your portfolio, Burkina Faso, no? Obscure country in Central Africa. The president decided he was going to extend his term limits. The people said no, they kicked him out. The military stepped in. They said, oh no, that's not what we had in mind, and they kicked the military out. So civil unrest is a global phenomenon now, not just a Middle East and North Africa phenomenon. In fact, it's not really. This is the one part of the world which seems to be most safe from it at this stage. So I think the regimes which are in place and are firmly in place today are very likely still to be in place and will continue to evolve. Now, you started at Tunisia and moved in this direction. I would actually move in the other direction too and look at the gradual evolution which is taking place in Morocco. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Algeria after President Bouteflika is no longer with us, and he's, well, whatever the news says, he's not in good health. We shall see. I am concerned about Egypt. I have to say I am concerned about Egypt because I do think, with all due respect to President Sisi, that as far as human rights in Egypt are concerned, there are causes for concern there today. And, you know, people used to say to me before Tahrir Square, Egyptians are very passive, they don't cause problems. Well, they've not been looking at Egyptian history closely enough. I think that's one country I would still be concerned about. I think the smaller GCC are fine. I don't have any problems with those at all, but I have to say I do agree with this previous speaker's comment on Saudi Arabia earlier on today.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, please help me to thank Mr. Alastair Newton. Alastair, thank you very much.
Thank you.